Here's your homework over target 1. So there's two things that we want to look at or look for whenever we are simplifying radicals. First thing we want to look for is anytime we have a perfect square. And then the second thing we want to look for is anytime you have a negative under your square root, because that means we have to involve that I that we just learned about today. So on this first one, I always pause and take a look at the square root. So this is the square root of 64, which hopefully you're recognizing is actually just 8. So in this case, our simplified version is going to be negative 40, and we don't even need to make a factor tree. If we did, it would be no big deal. We would get the same answer, but just taking a shortcut. So here we actually have that square root of a negative. So remember, we break that up into a negative 1 and positive 144. And so that means that the square root of negative 1 is I. And then here, again, we have the square root of 144, which hopefully you recognize as a perfect square, which is 12. And so 6 times 12 is going to give us 72i. Again, if you made a factor tree, no big deal. Just look out for those perfect squares. Alright, so looking at the square root of 343, notice that there is a negative under your square root here. So first thing I'm going to do is break this up. I have the negative out in front. I'm going to break that up into negative 1 and the square root of positive 343. And then I'm going to write that square root of negative 1 is I. And 343 is not a perfect square, so I have to come up with some factors for that. Got it. So that is 7 times 49. 7 is a perfect square. 49 breaks down into 7 and 7. So then we rewrite our problem. So we have negative I out in front. And then we have 7 times 7 times 7. Look for your pair. You have a pair of 7s, so that goes out in front with the negative I. The other 7 stays under. And then that would give me negative 7i square root 7. Alright, and then again, just pause every time you're starting a new problem. So I'm seeing the square root of 64. The square root of 64 we already talked about is 8. So this is just going to be 32. So for 3 of the 4 on the front, you didn't even have to make a factor tree. So just be aware of that. Alright, moving on to the back. So I have a 6 out in front. Square root of negative 1, make that 180 positive. So this is 6i square root 180. 180 is not a perfect square, so I have to make a factor tree. I'm just going to choose 18 and 10. Breaking that down further, remember you can choose whatever numbers you want as long as they multiply to give you that value above. And now I'm going to rewrite. So I have a 6i out in front. And then under I have 3 times 3 times 2 times 2 times 5. And so I'm going to look for pairs. So I have a pair of 3s and a pair of 2s. So I have a 3 and a 2 out in front. 6i is still out in front. Square root of 5 is still under. 3 times 2 times 6 is going to give me 36i square root 5 as my final answer. Taking a look at number 6, I have negative 8. I'm going to make that 28 positive by taking out the negative 1. So then that's negative 8i square root 28. 28 is not a perfect square. I'm going to break it down into 4 and 7. 7 is prime. 4 breaks down into 2 and 2. So rewriting my answer, I have negative 8i square root 2 times 2 times 7. Looking for pairs, I have a pair of 2s. So I have a 2 out in front that I bring in front of the radical, times the negative 8i that was already there. And this is negative 16i square root 7. The number 7. That negative isn't under the square root, so I don't need to worry about an I here. So I'm just going to go ahead and straight into breaking down 128 because it's not a perfect square. So I'm going to break it down into 2 and 64. 64 I could break down into 2 and 32. And I could do 2 and 16. 4 and 4, and then break this down into all the 2's. So when I go to rewrite this one, don't lose that negative out in front. And then we have a whole bunch of 2's. So I have 2 times 2 times 2, and I'm going to do check marks just so I get them all. And then I have 4 more 2's. Okay, I think I got them all. So then I look for pairs. So 3 pairs. Then I have that negative out in front, and the 2. So 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. I'm going to make that a negative 8 square root 2. Now remember, if you didn't have an I in your answer like we don't in this case, you can plug in your final answer and also your original problem, and it should give you the same answer or same decimal, so you can always check your work like that. So on 8, so again, I don't need to worry about I, there's no negative under the radical. 54 is going to break down into 27 and 2. 27 breaks down into 9 and 3. 9 breaks down into 3 and 3. So if I rewrite, I get negative 5 square root 3 times 3 times 3 times 2. So looking for a pair, I have a pair of 3's. So a 3 comes out in front, and I still have that negative 5 out in front. And then notice in this case we have a 3 and a 2 left under, and I just put a multiplication symbol in between them. So I'm going to multiply what's out in front, so negative 15, and multiply what's under the radical. And you can check your answer on this by plugging in your answer in your original problem. You should get the same decimal in your calculator. Alright, so no negative under the square root here. I'm going to go straight into my factor tree, so I'm going to say 90 and 2 for 180. Let's do 3 and 30, 3 and 10, 5 and 2. So when I go to rewrite, I have an 8, and then under the square root, I have 3 times 3 times 2 times 2 times 5. Looking for pairs. I have a pair of 3's, pair of 2's, I still have an 8 out in front, still have a 5 under, so 3 times 2 times 5 is going to give me 48 square root 5. On our last one, we do have a negative under the square root, so we've got to take care of that first. Square root of negative 1, square root of positive 125. So that means I have a 6i square root 125. So then this would be 25 and 5 is one way you could break that down. 25 breaks down into 5 and 5. So rewriting, I have a 6i square root 5 times 5 times 5. I'm going to look for pairs. So 5 comes out in front with the 6i. 1 5 stays under. So 5 times 6 is going to give me 30i square root 5. And that is your homework for Target 1.